you don't follow the money, you will not succeed in whatever it is you set out to do, because the outcome is still going to be dictated by money. So by following the money, you can actually reach the end point a little bit quicker than batting around in the undergrowth and not knowing where you're going. Me, it's as simple as to say, if there isn't an economics involved that works out, the whole thing will not work out.
This is just a taste of the challenging, thought-provoking, upending conversation that I had with David and Richard from Rethinking Choices. David and Richard are actually former hedge fund managers, and at the height of their quote-unquote success, they began to see that we simply couldn't invest our way out of the challenges of climate change. Now together they are focused on helping people to thrive in this reality. They work with communities and businesses to explore what they can do to have control over their own destinies in the face of climate change. And I think some of the things that they're going to share with you today might come as a surprise. For example, their advice to follow the money, or the fact that they're still deeply committed to capitalism. But David and Richard are all about an emergent vision of economics. And I think what they have to share will really help you and ground you if one of the things that you're really struggling with when it comes to your career change is this question of how you can make money, of how it can be financially viable, of how you continue to operate in our current economic reality while pursuing work that is purposeful, that brings you joy and that aligns with your values. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Get ready, it's quite an experience. Welcome to the Regenerative Work-Life Podcast. If you are ready to make the leap out of your corporate job and into purposeful regenerative work, this is the show for you. As you've probably discovered, transitioning into regenerative work is a lot more complicated than going on a job board and sending off your CV. This journey you are embarking on means taking risks, going against the grain, overcoming challenges, and writing your own script. It takes entrepreneurial muscle, powerful vision, and a willingness to change. Having a mentor by your side makes all the difference. I am your host, Alyssa Murphy. I have worked with hundreds of impact-focused businesses and individuals, and I am here to help you. Let's take things one step at a time as I show you how to quit corporate, find your vision, and successfully transition into regenerative work. Here we go. David, Richard, hello, and thank you for joining us here on the Regenerative Work Life. We're really looking forward to getting into your stories today and sharing your lessons for our listeners. What I'd love to do is, because you've had such a dramatic shift, both of you, I don't know if it felt dramatic at the time, but to come from being, hedge fund managers, being right inside of the extractive system, being at a point that would be considered by many to be highly successful, highly financial prosperous, and then choose to take a very different path into emergent economics. I think that's a really wonderful story. And I'd love to start at the point that things started to shift for you. I know that you started to sort of see the direction of travel. You started to kind of forecast and see how the economy was going to evolve. And that was part of what necessitated this change. So if you could take us there, perhaps, and bring us with you on this journey.
To start off on that bit, and you make it sound tremendously dramatic. It's actually not. It's in many ways a quite logical step. And it's actually, in some ways and forms, it's just an extrapolation of what you've been doing all your life. Despite 30 plus years in financial industry and the majority of those in hedge funds, I do not have, horns growing out of my head and sharp teeth, etc. It's a tough world, but actually, for the larger part, it's a world that tremendous amount of respect for, because I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the brightest minds, I'm sure, we have on this planet, including David, obviously. And it's a tremendous opportunity, and I'm internally grateful for the people that I've managed to forge that career with. And I've learned an awful lot along the way. At the same time, I've always had, some internal bugbears with issues, but they're not so much related to the financial world per se as to the economic system that we're operating under. And, I'm always a little bit fearful of becoming too technical, but there are, for to simplify it and look at it in the one lens, it's actually mostly got to do with our humanity's inability to respect limits and constraints because we don't like them, because it actually imposes restrictions on what we can and cannot do. So instead of kind of operating with those restrictions in place, we are constantly trying to cheat the system by finding ways of not actually respecting, at the end of the day, our planet. And that has always been a huge issue for me, particularly when it comes to things like accounting for economic growth, etc. And frankly, I don't understand why we are in this situation based on how we look at the pure economics of it, because we shouldn't be. We are actually smarter than that.
Well, you do understand, but you just don't kind of accept that we do that. But I should say, to add a little bit more color onto that along in the journey in that way. We spent quite a lot of time looking at sustainability and sustainability policies within hedge funds and sustainable investment opportunities. And one of the funny thing was we would talk about some idea, and then the next day we'll see it being published and top printed in the FT, and we think someone's bugging us in our office here about what's going on. And that's one of the biggest transitions, really, because working from a hedge fund, you work from the side where you keep everything very close to the chest. You don't tell anybody what you're really thinking, because that's how you make money. One of the investors, who a major institution, the mandate from them is essentially to take money from others in the market, because that was our job. It was to take money from other people who weren't as savvy about what may happen before that they realize it, so that that's possible, and so on. And there are nice financial terms and economic terms to talk about those activities, so that they improve the efficiency of the market and those kind of things. And in some ways, they do that. But ultimately, what led me was a couple of things. We were trying to see how we can come up with a proper sustainability approach. We went through everything that every other firm did. We read all their sustainability policies and reports, and we went through our own stuff, and we ended up holding a workshop that the two of us led, with the key people, the owners of the firm, and so on, and the principal people. And we basically, and what it had nothing to do with sustainability. And we asked, who are we? And that was what the workshop was about. Just asking, who are we? Coming up with sticky paper. What are we in this area? What do we think? And so on. And I think that we got into asking that because we had earlier looked at all the sustainability data sets. And as I mentioned before, I have a physics background. I'm a geek in that way. So we thought, okay, let's see how we can decide what really determines what makes a firm out of these data sets as being sustainable and what's not. We did some artificial intelligence and those sort of stuff on it. And we found that three things determined about 80% of the score. And those three things were: how big is the company, as in how many people did it employ? Where is the company domiciled? And what industry is it in? That's it. And the worst four firms were renewable energy companies, had the worst score in those data sets. And that really kind of confirmed for us that this is not the direction of travel we really like. It's not really facing, honestly, the challenge that we have, which the workshop was trying to understand, because that challenge is about, who are we? It's not sustainability that's the problem. It's because we don't fully understand who we are, so we do the wrong things. And I think that through COVID led us into that point where we thought, actually, you know what, maybe we should ask ourselves that, and we should actually make that change.
Wow, there's already so much for me to break down and wrap my head around. And for listeners, I've had the pleasure of speaking with David and Richard before, and I really just recommend, as I've said with other guests before, just sitting with the ideas that are being shared here, because a lot of this might feel quite disruptive. It might run quite contrary to the way that you've been thinking previously, and rethinking is in fact exactly what David and Richard are about. So I would just allow yourself to experience this without needing to try to sort of process all of it right now. And I think for me, there's a couple of things that I'd rather what I'd really like to focus in on is what you said right at the beginning, Richard, about it wasn't dramatic, it was logic. Because I think that a lot of people who are perhaps starting to see some of the same things that you are, for me personally, my equivalent of that workshop and running the analysis and realizing that the top worst 3 companies were renewable energy has been my experience with inside of climate tech. It's not that I think that there is no place for technology or that climate tech can't play an important role, but I began to see with a lot of experience that I had some really fundamental questions about the model that climate tech was built on, and how we were actually sort of understanding the impact that we could have through these technologies. And for me, without that sort of systemic piece, I really began to question whether that was the right path for us. But I think a lot of people who are maybe at that point starting to see their own version of the signals that the path that they're on, the organization that they're committed to is not heading in the right way. I think maybe they don't see it as logical. And I just wondered if you could say more about that, because I think that if people could feel like the choice to step outside of those extractive organizations and step outside of a sort of conventional career path and way of generating income was a logical and rational decision, I think it would really empower more people to make this kind of shift. But I think they feel like, as I said at the beginning, it's dramatic. It's a big, you're sort of like, I don't know, tearing it all off and burning it all down and, heading into the unknown. So could you just say more about that logic, how you understood it, and how you can help other people to understand that logic?
To start and give my angle of it, I'm sure there would be much more substance coming when David attacks that particular question. For me, I'm relatively narrow-minded individual, but I'm not. I know what I'm good at, and it ain't very much, like my wife likes to say. And the consequence when you've had the career I have had, which is basically education, out of education, you're straight into the financial world. And at a very young age, I was given responsibility for other people's money. At 22, I started managing portfolios. In my own world, I always tend to think of myself as a good trader, a very good trader. And it gives you the confidence that you can navigate situations because you're able to cope with whatever is being thrown at you. And that works really well as long as you are in control of what is happening. A large part of what we're seeing coming ahead of us is way beyond an individual's control, or even a collective of individuals' control. So all of a sudden you become in a world that is kind of unfamiliar to me because I cannot by my own ability navigate this. So that forces you to do the first rethink. He said that one of the reasons that people like David and I can take this step, any, is that because of our careers, we have a reasonable economic buffer. I could go out through the door and I didn't have to worry about a paycheck coming next month. Doesn't mean my means are infinite. I'm always thinking about what could I do to improve my income situation. But I have a buffer, unlike a lot of people. So that makes it easier. And I'm very willing to acknowledge that. But the real line of thought for me is with risks, because that's how I've navigated my professional career. And I know if I avoid the risks and I'm patient enough and I'm disciplined enough, the opportunities are like buses. They eventually come. You might have to wait, but they come. And when the opportunities come, I'm going to grab them and I'm going to profit from them, and I'm going to fulfill my sort of fiduciary duty to the people who entrusted me with the money. I'm going to deliver better returns than my neighbor. Then you start questioning that, because what's going to get thrown at me from here on are, like I said, it's beyond my personal ability to navigate this. And it ties back to our collective failure on this planet to actually recognize that there are limits we shouldn't breach. And for me, it's very obvious. And that's because of my career path. There are certain areas you just don't want to go into. And my thought process has always been, it's okay to get hit, it's okay to get bruised and battered a bit, but you cannot afford to ever get mortally wounded, because you're not going to come back from that. And in practical terms, it's like you just don't go into certain areas when the risks are too big, because if I get seriously hurt here, I've impaired my whole future ability to do what I promised my investors. We are heading full throttle into that world at the moment, without any respect for the risks and the fact that we are surrounded by signs that says this is a no-go zone. And we are doing it in some blind belief that somehow technology will help us out down the road, because we can all read the numbers and we can all see with our own eyes the physical effects of what we are doing in the world. And still we are going straight along. And for me, it's very troublesome, because it's completely at odds with my whole thinking. But the logical step for me to think I need to reassess what's going on here is that I cannot solve this by myself, no matter how good I am at my role at trading out of a position or into a position. It actually, on the margin, might help me a bit, but it doesn't change the dial in terms of where we are heading. So I need to do a profound and more rethink about, for a better word, purpose.
Yeah, the image that came up in my mind was that scene, in the films or in the cartoon where, the train is on the track and there's the signs going like, no, danger, do not cross, like imminent danger of death, cliff ahead, like stop now. And the train is just hurtling on. And
Yeah.
yet somehow so many of us somehow feel safer on that train than jumping off of the train and then, being in uncharted territory. But, if we see it that way, I want to get off the train. If the signs are clearly telling me the train is hurtling off the cliff, I'm going to take my chances in the sort of cartoon desert and find my way through that. I'm going to find my way to an oasis and find some water, or I don't know what it is, but like I know I don't want to go off of that cliff edge.
I think there's another side to that, and that's it's the first out of our tagline stories, or whatever that you
Our
have,
lessons, yes.
our
Yes.
lessons.
So let me
And
introduce the lesson as you're taking us nicely to the lesson. The first lesson was that the world has a place for you. That's how it's better, because you are in it. So David, tell us about this lesson.
and we wrote our experience in the book called The Unsustainable Truth. And there we talk about how did we and the world get into this situation. And it's because the lesson from our upbringing and our few centuries since, Richard says I keep going on about the Enlightenment. Since the Enlightenment, it's very much that, this is your place, is to be on this train. But the world actually has a place for you. And that's what we discover through researching into the book and through our own sense, as what Richard is describing. He's describing the impetus to move, but there needs to be a draw. And that draw comes from each of us individually, comes from us within. It's not that we felt, okay, fine, we're okay, we don't need to make a move, or we've got some savings and we can make a move. It's because we actually felt there was something that is more purposeful for us as individuals. And this is not purposeful in the sense of saying, saving the world is purposeful. This is purposeful as in there's a field I can stand in and be who I am. That there's a place that is there for me. And it's precisely for me. I'm perfectly suited. I need to find my skills, gather my strength, figure out what I do, find my pace, figure out what it is. But there is a place for us and for each of us. And there's a very strong and firm belief that we have between Richard and myself along, and how we can actually then turn our economy around in that way. From one which is directed to say, your place is here, to one that says, from where you are, that is your place. That's how our economy comes. That's how it emerges. And that's really crucial, because that is how the world is better, is because we're able to find that place for ourselves. So getting off that train is not simply because there's this red sign and we're hurtling towards the edge of the cliff and all of those things. It is actually because even if it stopped, we would still want to go out and go away from that train, because that's where we more naturally are. So those two things together completes the logic.
Yeah, because somewhere in that cartoon desert that I'm imagining, there's an oasis waiting for you.
Yes.
Always.
Yes.
Yeah, and
And
I mean, it's really joyful to hear you talking about this, because it's really also one of the basis of my work with clients, is that this exploration that we do, this transition that we make into, as I term it, regenerative careers, is really a process of self-actualization. It's born out of who you are and what really matters to you and what brings you joy. And for me, that means that the rewards are so much more than, as you say, just choosing the most sustainable career path for you. It's also, I think, it's also a challenge, because, as you say, we are so used to being told where we fit. We're being used to being told this is your path. And, and to then be handed the opportunity, but also the responsibility to find your own place, as you said, I think, can feel quite overwhelming to people. Have you found that in your experience?
we talked about in the Unsustainable Truth about this sense of fear of missing out.
Yeah.
This sort of FOMO, and about the idea that there is no alternative. And those are very strong psychological guardrails in some ways that protect the structure of the economy we have today. And from thinking of choices within those guardrails, it is always extremely fearsome to think of stepping outside or climbing over or doing whatever else that may be. And I think what helps is the sense of actually looking around, spending more time looking around, and looking at really the diversity of people and the diversity of nature everywhere around, and just really absorbing it in and not really thinking too much about what I need or what I don't, to get that connection back in some ways. When you have bills coming in and you've got mortgages and your kids have kind of needs and all the rest, and you've got an elderly parent who needs looking after and all of those things, those are part of the things that strengthens all the guardrails. Being able to look around opens up the sort of conversations. You need conversations to go past talking about the bills to actually talking about the things that you may want to talk about. And that, in some sense, is what we did with that workshop. When we did the workshop, not on what do we do that's sustainable at all, we did it on who are we. We actually tried to take away all of the pressures of saying what we need to do, to just asking, who are we? At the different levels, as a firm, as ourselves, as all of those things. And I think that you need to do those exercises to be able to see that actually it's not that the play somehow comes along. You are going to find you're going to have bills and you don't know what to do with them and so on. But what it does, it unleashes your own sense of self and a bit of that inspiration, imagination. There's something that we've been working with a gentleman who used to be an asylum seeker, and he's now settled in the UK. He's from Zimbabwe, and we've been working on. He's now working as a comedian, and he wanted to think about how he can make use of his skills and how he can actually establish some sort of business and things. And we started thinking about this thing called "Open the Door, Embrace the Future," and it's a short form theater based activity. You do things like act your emotion and things like that, and so on. And you do need things like that to just release yourself a bit, to be able to get past.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. It's why I talk about and encourage my clients to play. And I think play has a really important role in this.
Yeah.
Perhaps that links us nicely to your second lesson, in fact, which is discovering your presence and turning it into an economic presence. I think we've already started to touch into this topic. So tell us more about connecting your presence with economic presence.
To pass that one over to David, because he actually explains it about 1,000 times better than I do. For me, it's like I'm good at something and I'm going to keep doing this. But he actually has a bit more nuance to the answer than I have.
I think that's not fair. I mean, we work together, so our presence is also in each other, and it's often very difficult to think that you have to do it yourself. So one of the first part of this is that, if you're an actor and you think about presence and you stand on the stage, that presence is meaningless if there is no audience. The presence is kind of reflected through the people you connect with, and that's really an important recognition of that. Where do I start? People talk about as I mentioned earlier, there's a field which is yours and you can stand in. But if you are the only thing in that field, then that's all there is. But you actually have to look around and realize even if there's nobody there, there are still things in the field. You still have a presence amongst those. So very much strongly, I think of it of nature as with a capital N, which is not just the animals and plants and things that people talk about having to conserve, but actually nature as that which we are a part of and which is a part of us in that way. And your presence is that presence there. And so if you start thinking about how do I speak to people, what do I talk about, what things do I do, and most importantly, it talks to a pace that's your own pace. When you need to do things faster than what is your natural pace, if you need to complete a work by, this afternoon and it's not your natural pace, you get exhausted, you get tired, you get burnt out. When you have to do it slower, because you naturally can get it done, but your colleague sort of says, don't rush it, and whatever it is, you get frustrated and you get stressed, and then it affects you the same. In both of those things, you end up using more energy than you need. You end up not really achieving the person that you are. So presence is about discovering what is your own pace as well as the connections around. And once you start paying attention to that, you can then experiment and start thinking, actually, well, we talk a lot about doing this, or I do this for someone. Here's an example. There's a lady I knew from my church community. She was an elderly Italian lady, and one day she got a letter from the bank and she doesn't understand it. It's just a notification letter. And she said, look, David, can you read it and tell me what they say? And it doesn't say anything. And she says, okay, thank you. That's really giving me peace of mind. And she gave me £10 and says, why don't you give this to your children? And I was like, oh, don't give me that. I'll just do that. And she was saying, no, do. There is an economics to our connections. People of an older generation naturally feels that. And it's not an extractive economics of turning you into a buyer and a seller. It is a way of recognizing we all need to eat. We all take people's time and we all need to eat. And that's where the connection and through your presence turns into an economic presence. And when you can start thinking of that, it becomes much more natural to say, can you pay me something for this? Whereas without thinking of it, being able to establish in that way, always feels like I am actually corrupting that connection, but it's not.
Wow. What I'm hearing is that almost the way you describe it, it makes me think that, and I love that story you said it with the elderly Italian lady. I think it was such a good example that, you showed up to help her. You were just there. You were able to do something for her. You connected with her. You gave her reassurance. I'm sure it was more than just the translation. I'm sure it was also just how you interacted, with her, and just helped her to feel that surety. And of course, you had no expectation that there would be any kind of economic return for your action. And this idea that if we can, it just strikes me that it takes so much trust and faith to really embrace this lesson, that when we really come into our presence, we really understand our place in that field, our connection with the insects and the crops and the trees around us. And that it's almost like it's an exchange of value, that you have value by being in that field, you had value by being there in the church, open to having the conversation with that woman, and that we can trust that economic value will come back to us when we're in
Yeah.
present. It's
Yes.
such a different way to the extractive model, where you don't set foot on the field until you know that there is going to be some kind of compensation for you.
Absolutely. And it is that is how Richard and I start thinking in terms of how economics emerges, as opposed to a very extractive economics that we live under. Again, I go back to Richard's comment about being on the train and those things. We started on this journey on appreciating that there is an issue. We are running over a cliff, and where we end up taking to is to appreciate that, okay, that's a calling for us to really seek out how to be ourselves.
I want to just take a moment from this conversation with David and Richard to offer you support and guidance. Look, the topics that we're talking about here are monumental. We are describing whole life shifts. We are describing a whole new way of thinking and separating from perceived wisdom and the conventional well-trodden path. You are being called to step out on your own, discover new possibilities, new ways of being, new ways of receiving value. All of that is so much easier when you have a trusted guide by your side. Now look, I'm not going to pretend to you that I know the exact path that is right for you. Only you know that. But I can offer so many tools to help you navigate that path with confidence and clarity. I offer 2-week one-to-one coaching where we'll start with a deep dive into your regenerative pathway, and then use that time and the 2 weeks afterwards to map out a really clear pathway for you so that you know the action steps that you need to take. If you're interested to learn more and you want to connect with me and see if it feels like a good fit, book a discovery call at regenerativeworklife.com/discovery, and I can't wait to get to know you. Now, let's get back to David and Richard. So take me to lesson 3, because this one is a juicy one. The lesson 3 is follow the money. I am so curious to hear your take on this, because my immediate sort of impression is that it's going to be completely counter to the beautiful image of emergent economics that we've just discussed. And I can imagine people just hearing follow the money and think, wait, isn't that exactly what got us into this mess in the first place? So I'm really, over to you. I really want to hear about this one.
On what you say in some respect, but it's actually because it's the easy path to take. If you don't follow the money, succeed in whatever it is you set out to do, because the outcome is still going to be dictated by money. So by following the money, you can actually reach the end point a little bit quicker than batting around in the undergrowth and not knowing where you're going. Because it's simple for me, it's as simple as to say if there isn't an economics involved that works out, the whole thing will not work out. In a model, and I have enormous respect and belief in the capitalist model. I am a capitalist, all the way out to my fingertips. I believe in capitalism, which is very different from how most people see it as a tool for enriching themselves. We're all capitalists when we have the upside, and then all of a sudden, when we're facing the downside, we become socialists, right? Because then someone else should step in and take care of my problems. I believe in capitalism because I believe it's the only way of actually ensuring economic progress over time. What I strongly dislike is the corrupted capitalist model that has evolved over the last 20, 30 years and really been turbocharged over the last 10 years or so by incredibly crazy policies like zero interest rates. That is just wrong in a true capitalist model, which I happen to believe in. Now, follow the money means that if you are at odds with good economics, your whole business venture will not work out. There is still something that says, if I have a good business, actually, and pretty soon, actually, in my mind, has to also to make money. One of the crazy fallouts we've had over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that a lot of businesses that are valued at extreme multiples are losing money. Don't actually need to worry about the economics when interest rates are zero. I can just raise more capital and keep growing and actually cannibalize and destroy good businesses along the way. So for me, the worst and most anti-capitalist measure we've taken is to delete the price of money. It really is wrong. But I'm sure David's going to elaborate more on the following suit story of how following the money is imperative if you want to find out what's going on and be successful in your venture.
I think
I'm really
sorry,
sorry.
Alex.
I'm really curious to hear, yeah, to connect the dots between what you've just shared, Richard, and what you were saying previously, David, about finding your presence and connection with nature. Because I can understand the logic of what you're saying, Richard, and I agree with it. Actually, it's my approach also, but I'm wondering how we do that without getting sucked back into the extractive system.
I think that's where you have to follow the money.
Yeah.
So you go back to the situation I had with reading the letter for the elderly lady, and you see that money, and that money, as you described, came from a connection. It came from spending the time and getting engaged together. It's the consequence of that engagement. It's the consequence of developing that relationship that there is ability for each of us to eat, thrive in that way along there. And the point of follow the money is a fallacy to imagine that we have to sacrifice every money or somehow change the whole world in that way. I think there's a great tendency to try to say that the big money world is evil and we have to somehow destroy it all. What we need to do is actually to try and understand how that money path is really going, what it means by follow the money and see. So, and then you need to decide for yourself, how do I want to connect with that in that way? At the moment, Elon Musk is now the officer in charge of the new Department of Government Efficiency. Now, Doge is clearly for Dogecoin, and he clearly had. I put in a LinkedIn post on it this morning. It's actually, look it up in that way. What he's done is he's used it to promote his own personal benefit because he owns a bunch of Dogecoins. In that way, he chose the acronym. He did all those things. It could be called many things. It could be called, I think I put in the post, a independent office of efficient government. In that way, and it would be more appropriate because it's not actually a government department.
I mean, it does
And
sound like a completely made up thing, which
it's
it is.
the point here is he has used government to benefit himself. by manipulating the capital market. And he is in a position to rein in the SEC through his recommendation on those actions. And when you follow the money in that situation, what you find is he gets to gain huge amounts from this. If you want to go and say, I'm going to invest in Dogecoin and take advantage of this trend, you have to ask yourself, how am I making that money? How does that itself follow? Follow the money. Where is it really coming from? It's coming from supporting probably the extreme of corruption that you can have. And you need to find your own place and figure out, okay, am I happy with that? Maybe I actually really need to pay a bill and that's what I need to do. That's fine. But you have to be wary about how, to the extent to which you end up rationalizing yourself that way. Are you genuinely trying to find the place that's for you? Or are you just trying to keep yourself going along?
Okay, now it's clicking into place for me. Yeah, now I'm really coming to understand. So what I'm hearing is that follow the money is not, it's not a directive to say follow the money and that is the right direction to go in. There is an element of that, as Richard described, but it's, start with understanding where that money really comes from. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't want to do for very understandable reasons. And I think we're all acknowledging that sometimes you just have to pay the bills, you have to put food on the table, do what you need to do to support your family. But most of the people, certainly that I work with and that will be listening to this, are coming from a place of a certain amount of financial privilege. And I think when we recognize that privilege, then we really need to ask that question of where is that money coming from? And one of the ways that I interpret that is really ask yourself, what is the purpose of the organization that I work for? What is the ultimate purpose of the organization? And in many cases, that leads in a very extractive and very often corrupt direction. So I think that's a really great starting point for just being really honest with yourself. You may be very, very attached to your corporate salary and that, nice regular paycheck and the generous bonus payments that you receive, but have you really taken the time to follow that money and really understand the consequences, everyone and everything that is impacted by that money? But I'm also hearing on the other side of it, as you sort of choose a path that is in alignment with who you are and with your values, that it's still important to follow the money because, we need to find, we still, that is still how we exchange value and sustain ourselves. And, I think this is, I do talk to people who have pursued a sort of a regenerative path and ended up in a place where they still believe very much, they are aligned with their values, but they're also not coming from a place of joy because they've just not been able to generate any income, or their story has very much been one of always struggling, to make ends meet. And I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of when they think of moving in new directions and emergent economics, is that they're going to be in that place where they can't make money. It feels almost incompatible to them to think that they can go through that process of self-actualization and also make money. But I think what I'm hearing from you is that it is absolutely possible, but it's about us having that awareness of, where the demand is, where that value exchange is going to come from.
Yeah. And you end up, one of the things that in the past couple of years since we've left the finance world that we've learned substantially from is interacting with people who are largely out in Kenya, some in Pakistan, places where the money isn't generally available. There is very little. Very often, there isn't the. It becomes very much hand to mouth, day by day, as a result. In that way, but what you find among them are really the most ardent believers in the future. They are the people with the greatest belief that life for them is going to be one where they can thrive in that way. And I think that's a distinction that's important because we've talked a lot about making money, and that's the value proposition of the extractive economy. Everybody can make money. The crisis we face is one where costs are increasing. When you look at the tragedy in Spain with the flooding, your insurance is going to go up because it's the same insurance company who's going to be covering for them. And they know they can't put up the premium there, so they can put up your premium as a result. And that's just one of the ways in which the costs are going to go up. And it's very interesting when you look in the grain markets and the soft commodities markets, and they talk about a bullish world. Well, that means wheat prices and corn prices and things like that are going to go up. It sounds fantastic as a bullish world, but actually for everyday people, that means it's going to be a harder world. And that happens because farmers are having a tough time, it's more volatile, there's less uncertainty, there needs to be more of a premium just in case kind of thing that's going along. So those things says that making money as being the question, can I make money, is actually going to be less relevant to one of saying, how do I thrive? How do I want to thrive? There's absolutely no promise that you can have everything you want. But the point about the world having a place for you is that actually, if you can figure out what it means for you to thrive, then you find that place. And follow the money allows you to go along and say, actually, you know what? I really don't want to go down that path. I know there's money there, but that's not me.
So, in many ways, we're asking the wrong question, because the big question that people have is, how do I, how do I live in accordance with my values and still make money?
I think that is the majority would subscribe to that. There are always outliers on any side of any distribution, but the vast majority subscribe to that. But again, it also ties back to this needs to make money. You cannot keep on backing things that are money losing just because you enjoy doing it. Then you need to find another way on the side to actually, because economics is economics and it has to work out. And I think it's very important that you're constantly grounded in that reality. It's not that economics per se is flawed. It's how we operate the economic model that, for me, that's flawed. Economics at the base of it is very sound. You have a good product or a good service, you make money. If it's a bad product or a bad service, you're not going to make any money from it. And then you need to move on and find something else.
Yeah, I remember you shared in a previous conversation, you shared me the example of someone who dried fruit, or an equivalent,
Exactly.
this, sort of small local artisan business, all the things that we think, we need, and, and there's nothing wrong with drying fruit. But in this particular case, you were saying that like this entrepreneur was really struggling with the electricity costs involved in drying the fruit.
Yeah.
And your point was, you can complain about the electricity costs, or you can think, either I need to find a different way to dry the fruit, I need to air dry it, or whatever it might be. I don't know anything about drying fruit, but the electricity part isn't working for me. I need to find a different way to do that. Or drying fruit is not, is not the business model that is going to make sense.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's a fantastic example, because one of my biggest bugbears, again, the capitalist speaking here, was when we had the sharp rise in energy prices, particularly electricity prices. And Western governments did, in their infinite wisdom, to shield people from reality by handing out checks and saying, here's a check from your friendly government, so you don't have to bear the full price of rising energy prices. What you're effectively doing is you're stealing from your children and grandchildren, and that never sits very easy with me. But it's also absolutely giving a green card to bad businesses to continue to operate. The reality is that energy has probably been too cheap for too long, and we got a very sharp rise. We have eaten dried fruit for centuries, millennia, but we probably sun-dried it and air-dried it. We didn't do it in massive sort of centrifuges that are doing it in a very short period of time and consuming huge amounts of energy. And the notion that I have a great business and then I got hit with energy costs is just completely, to me, mind-numbingly stupid. It's a large part of your business. If you're going to dry the fruit that way and the market has decided that this is the price, find another way. Or if you can't, then, maybe we shouldn't have dried fruit in the UK because it's too cold. Maybe they should do it in the Middle East or in Africa, where you can probably put everything out in the sun in a couple of hours and it's fine. But the whole idea of not facing the reality sits extremely uneasy with me. And what governments effectively did in economic terms were they sent the biggest check to the biggest users and the biggest consumers of energy, the people who had least interest of reining in their use. They got the biggest reward. I mean, how are you wired as a politician if you think that will ever be a good policy?
I think this is going to bring us on to lesson 4, but there is one comment I want to make about our fruit drying example, because in case it's not abundantly clear to listeners, I'm not an economist, but what really made sense to me with that example is that if you follow the economics, it naturally leads you back to a truly sustainable business model. That it's actually the economics that are driving you to say stop using electricity in your business, find natural sources, like genuinely renewable sources to do this. Or, as you say, accept that we can't have readily available dried fruit everywhere in the world, that there's a reason that has traditionally been done in certain climates and certain geographies. And I think it naturally leads us back to a much more sustainable way of producing goods, which, like, it just really clicked when I heard that, of kind of in some ways what it means to follow the money, and and how economics can guide us. But on the flip side, as we're talking about, giant payouts and supporting inherently unsustainable businesses, let's have a look at our lesson number 4, which is all about fossil fuels. So your lesson here is to thrive and imagine your own roadmap with coal, oil, and gas. So tell us about what our personal relationships with fossil fuels can look like, because I think so many of us are frustrated to the point of where frustrated is just not even an appropriate word anymore, with the lack of action around phasing out fossil fuels. So over to you.
I think we have we have personal relationships with food. We can have personal relationships with you see people talk about their vegan journey or their meat journey or whatever it is in that way, and you end up developing an awareness of that around. The oil and gas and coal are three principal providers of energy for the world. They account for over 80% of all the energy that's used, which basically means that, you know, simply put, think of 4 out of 5 things you did this morning since when you got out of bed. Basically, they would not have been possible. And because you can't exactly identify which is which, essentially all of them would not have been possible in that way. So start thinking of that as being your journey, and use that as to say, how many of those really help you thrive? How many of those are things that you just engage with because of various reasons? And often a lot of those things are things that actually stops you from thriving. And think about that as saying, imagine. And because we have to imagine the future if we want the possibilities to be possible. One of the great things about the problem with people who suffers a lot from anxiety and depression and those sort of things is they cannot imagine that future. And so they're caught in in the present in that way. So you have to be able to imagine that future in some ways to actually see, how can I imagine now a path? How can I create stepping stones towards it? And turn those into little experiments that I can try. Now, this is important. There's a distinction between doing an experiment and trying things in that way. The point of an experiment is it may not work. Otherwise, it's not an experiment. But the point about an experiment is that knowing it may not work, you want to get something from it, even if it doesn't work, so that you can actually go on further. And if we can't actually think about oil and gas and coal in a personal way in terms of saying what it is, and I'll give another example along. I have, we have a car, like many people. It's a heavily diesel consuming car. So I try to use it as little as possible. I use it when I feel I really want to use it, because I use it to visit my mum when I need to be able to get to her in time in that way. But around London where I live, I basically walk everywhere. I went to see a friend at the Excel Centre that was 3 hours away. So I went there, walked there, and then walked back along. And those are the kind of things that you end up experimenting, and then you find I didn't start by doing that. I started by going down to Sainsbury's and walking there instead of driving to my local Sainsbury's. And that's 10 minutes down the road walking. So why ever did I ever drive there before? And what happened as a result of me walking is I have a much greater control of my shopping. That's what came out of it. Because I wasn't just filling up the trolling pile in the car, because I had a backpack with me. And I would be able to only fill that up. So I then started thinking what it is. My wife hated me because she kept coming back and said, the fridge is empty. I kept saying, no, it's full. You just don't see what's there. Which is the other part of what experimenting does, which is the other part of imagining your own roadmap with oil, gas, and coal is going to help you do. It's going to help you see what's there that you would not see if you did not actually go ahead and do that. What it really does is it prepares you for the opportunity that if it becomes possible to say you can keep oil, gas, and coal in the ground, you may actually be ready to say, you know what, I'm for that. Because at the moment, you cannot see how that could possibly be there. So you have to start by thinking, how do I thrive? How you imagine that, and actually thinking of that journey.
I absolutely love what you're sharing here. I love the concept of experimentation. I think that's something I really want to offer to listeners who are embarking on this journey. I use the word play, but I think it's essentially the same thing. The beautiful thing about play is there's no succeed or fail. If you watch children playing with blocks, they have like no interest in actually accomplishing a tower. That's something we as adults put onto their play. And like, oh, you're building a tower. I'm like, no, I'm seeing what happens if I put this block on this block and how many I can put up before it falls down. And, there is no success or failure in pure play. And I think exactly the same with the experimentation, that there is success or failure, but you're fully embracing it. That's what you're coming into the experiment for. And I also love, because I think the biggest theme that's emerging for me from our conversation is the word thrive, and really reimagining what it means to thrive. Because I think conventionally we think of thrive very much attached to financial prosperity or financial income. And I love that. As soon as you said that example of walking to meet a friend, 3 hours away and walking through London, I was thinking all of the things you must have experienced on that walk. The health benefits, the fresh air, the vitamin D, the things that you will have seen, the time that you had alone with your thoughts, like all of those experiences that aren't there when you just, I don't know, call an Uber. And that I think exactly that we can really start to reimagine that this isn't just about sacrifice. I don't think sacrifice is a helpful way of thinking of this. That when we make these decisions to personally start to divest in some areas and experiment with what can it look like for me to divest from fossil fuels, or we look to separate from extractive economics by choosing more carefully who we work for because we're following the money, that's when we can really start to thrive, because we're opening up all of these possibilities and experiences and benefits that, as you say, we just don't see that they're there yet until we start to experiment and until we start to play.
And I think you're right in the choice of words. Sacrifice is a tough sell. Choices is much better way to label it, because ultimately David and I, we're very firm believers in individual choice. and that our actions ultimately matter. And that comes with the accountability. If I have the right to do things, because I'm very strong at advocating those rights, with those rights always comes the responsibility that you actually have to take charge of the outcome. You cannot shy away from that. I think that's hugely important. But going back to experimentation, it's such an important cornerstone for all progress humanity has made over millennia. Constantly experiment while not necessarily knowing it. But the typical action you take is you try something new, and if you get burned, you retrace your step and you choose a different path. And that's how we made progress all through time. And what terrifies me and David is when you hear definitive sort of layout from policymakers saying this is how we do it, without any sort of disregard for the fact that you might be wrong. So we're building 5,000 wind towers in the North Sea because we're going to electrify Britain and take us away from oil, gas, and coal. Spends is monumental on any measure we want to use for calculating it. And then we figure out that actually, because of global warming, our wind patterns are changing and there is no wind in that part of the North Sea. You have 5,000 towers and the investment you've taken there, which is actually now obsolete. Know what it will do to a bird population, migrating birds. We don't know what it will do to a sea population. So instead of saying we're going to build 5,000 towers in place X, maybe we should build 50 and see, did this actually work out? And second boss I had a long time ago, probably before you were born, he said something that stuck with me. And he was an absent boss. He was constantly traveling, lobbying for us as an organization internally, how we should get more money diverted to us because we were best at what we were doing. And he said, trouble with the world, Richard, is that the smart people are always so full of doubt and the stupid ones are certain. Sums that dilemma up. This is how we do it. There is no discussion about the fact that what happens if you're wrong, which ties back to the whole risk aspect. What happens if I'm wrong here? And I'm singling out politicians because I don't particularly like them, and I don't like the people we have elected into politics because we have made it a career choice rather than a natural step for people to take when they have something to offer society, which is actually how I think it should be. I bring a certain amount of experience with me. Now I have a desire to serve. A little bit like the learn, earn, return philosophy of life. I'm absolutely gobsmacked when I hear them on television or on the news saying, this is how we do it. And the decisions they're taking are enormous in terms of the resources they're using. And they're certain this is going to be right. There isn't any sense of maybe we should try an experiment first to see if this actually is a good idea. No, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, so you can really see, I hope people can see and hear the value, because I think I talk a lot about this experimentation. For me, it's like I described like the wilderness years as I came out of climate tech and then found my way into what I do now. And there was a lot of that during which I felt quite lost, because what I was doing didn't make sense on any kind of conventional career path. It wasn't what I was expected to do. You sell a business and then you go into consulting and you sit on boards and you make a lot of passive income. And that was never going to be the path for me. Suddenly I'm like, hanging out in the woods and, spending time in nature and, and all of these kind of things that just was so off of the kind of the beaten track. But I think I really want to encourage people to understand that this, as you say, experimentation is the logical kind of way to approach this. Experimentation actually reduces risks. The really terrifying thing is to say with absolute certainty, I'm going to go all in on this decision, put everything behind it. As with your example of, humongous wind farms, that's when things become really scary.
Yeah.
So speaking of the questionable decisions made by those in power. I think that brings us really nicely to your final lesson. So let's bring our conversation home with this one. Your fifth lesson: it's not government, it's you and the things that bring you joy.
Well, I think we look today, if you listen to the news, it's like the government's not doing this, the government's not doing that. And we've come to a situation where we expect governments to fix problems. And in The Unsustainable Truth, we talk about how that came to be the case after the war. And governments started to try to defeat the business cycle, allows plain sailing all along and promise prosperity in that way. And there was a Nobel laureate in economics called Elinor Ostrom, and she got a Nobel Prize in 2015. She was the first woman to get a Nobel Prize.
In
And
economics.
in economics. And
Yeah.
she interestingly said, the role of governments and policymakers and so on is to create institutions that allow people to bring out the best of themselves. It wasn't to fix the problems so that people can be the best of themselves, but it was to allow people to come together and do that and resolve the problems. And if I take climate change at the moment as being one of the problems everybody really ought to be thinking about, they're not thinking about it, because if you thought of going to Spain for your holiday, you'd probably think another time, as an example of what's going on there, let alone the tragedy of the people actually immersed in there. It itself carries a really interesting story for me, which is after the flooding in Valencia, the tens of thousands of young people who got their brooms out and just walked over there to sweep the streets. And they pouted the government because they say the governments were not doing anything. That's the reality. The problems that we face are really quite substantial, and governments are running out of money. That's the short of it. Just the same as most households are finding that they live from paycheck to paycheck. Governments are doing the same. And when you then go along and actually ask, well, how do we go forward and do that? You end up having to realize a lot of these things are not really technology problems. Climate change is not a technology issue. It's not even an economic issue. It's a social issue. It's about how we want to be together in facing a challenge. Communities face challenges all the time, and they face it as a social issue. And when they do that, they bring in economics and they bring in technology that may be there. But it has to start from recognizing, do we want to be a community together to face this, or do we not? And when you look to that and you think about what are governments there to do, and you go back to the theories of governments, that very much is how we currently still run our governments. They're there to fight wars. That's what you do. The king used to ride around with a horse, with a spear, or whatever it is, and go and fight wars. And they signed treaty afterwards, but they fought the wars so that they signed the treaties, and then they'd fight the wars again. And today that may be an economic war, or may actually be a physical war, but that's exactly what they do. And it has to be the people. And why is it people? Because people share the things that give them joy. That's what connects them. So when you go back and you want to take what for us a personal question to start asking, how does that help me think about whole world, is to recognize that people all around the world share the things that give them joy.
Back to follow that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I don't have that much of substance to add, hardly anything, and probably nothing. Focus very much on David's first part, because I think it's not how 99% of the population see it. That ultimately a government or a country is restricted by any other economic measure, like a person or a household or a company or a business is. And we do not think of it that way. Because I can never ever turn the television on to watch the news without hearing someone demanding that the government spends more money on their pet project. And I know I sound, vicious here, but that's basically what it's about. Think, largely speaking, that the government's resources are infinite. They're not. They have slightly more leeway than a company or, a household have, because they can actually print money in the short term, because that's the currency we use. And the government has that ability. But that's just a monetary illusion. It doesn't bring any wealth because ultimately it all results in inflation. We as a society here, and it comes back to the right and the responsibility of the individual to actually take and face the consequences of your actions. As you hear now, I have a very strong libertarian streak. David used to say that I'm like
Ron Swanson.
Ron
There's this
Swanson.
TV series called Parks and Recreation. It's a
Yeah,
really great sitcom series, and there's a character there, Ron Swanson, whose job is to make his job disappear.
yeah. And I think he has a young intern when he says, "What can the government do for you?" Absolutely nothing is how he starts his lecture to this young intern. I'm not at that point. But I'm definitely in a position where I think we are shying away a lot from individual responsibility and passing that parcel on to government that is already overextended with obligations. And there is no money. That is the reality that people all over the world will have to face. The governments do not have any money. If you looked upon them as a business or a household or an individual, no bank in the world would lend you a penny with those finances that the UK or the US are actually displaying. This is the equivalent of a debt trap. You are going to face as a country down the road, whether it's in 6 months or a couple of years, some very, very harsh decisions about what actually constitutes obligations towards your citizens. And they're going to be a lot less of that than there is now. And I think, again, 99% of people do not see that. And they better start doing that very soon because that's the reality. Follow the money. If you follow the money and you read the government finances, you will rapidly conclude there is a lot less coming from the government going forward than there was previously. Of course, again, we have absolutely refused to acknowledge there are limits. We want it all and we want it now. And if we don't get it from our government, we're going to elect someone who promises that, actually having figured out where that money is going to come from. So, yeah, we will have to face a lot more decisions on an individual basis where we have the right to make those decisions and the responsibility to face the consequences of them. And that's kind of my final take home on on that particular bullet point and life lesson.
Yeah, and I would just bring it back a little bit in saying that you never do face them on your own,
No,
because everybody is connected through. Is connected through the things that give us joy. And
exactly.
it's worth remembering that when you feel you're facing that on your own.
And I think, I can feel myself wanting to sort of bring us home on a hopeful note. And I think, but what I actually think that you, between you and how you've woven the conversation, what you've shown us beautifully is that we need to get comfortable with this kind of juxtaposition of fear and joy and hope and grief. And it's all necessary, and it's all, different sides of the same coin. And I think it's really important actually to allow that discomfort. That on the one hand, we're looking at the systems that we thought were there to support and save us, and rapidly realizing that that just isn't going to happen. And that's terrifying. But on the other hand, what's opening up to us is this incredible opportunity to find our place in the world, to pursue joy, and to be in community, and to be navigating these challenges alongside each other.
Absolutely.
David, Richard, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I know that you have given people so much to, I was going to say think about, but just to really embody and just, to allow to be and see how it changes them, which I really believe it will. I will include links, of course, to your books and your website in the show notes, but where's the best place for people to connect with you if they want to continue the conversation?
David or Richard at rethinkingchoices.com.
To answer as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here on the podcast.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you for listening to the Regenerative Work-Life podcast. It's time to put what you learnt today into practice. Remember, you were called to this work for good reason. Nature needs each and every one of us, and you can do this. If today's episode has been helpful, please take the time to share it with someone who needs a little guidance in stepping out of corporate and into regenerative. Learn more about how I can help you find your vision for a work life filled with purpose, impact, and joy at regenerativeworklife.com and connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search Alyssa Murphy. I'll see you back here soon for the next episode.